Alrighty, hello everybody. How you doing? We're back today talking about Scotland, England, Scottish independence, that sort of stuff. Today we're going to be talking about finances. We're going to be talking about Scotland's supposed debt. All right. So I got an article today here from a gentleman named Gordon McIntyre Kemp, and he's obviously a bean counting type of guy, and he wrote an article talking about how Scotland's debt is really an illusion, and he goes into a fair amount of depth into explaining that. So I'm going to go ahead and go through that article here right now. We're going to go through it, and so you guys can see what's in it. He also mentions the Macron report in this article. I'm going to be covering that in my next video, so I'm going to be looking into that. That is a document that was made in 1974 to report the Scottish economy. And it was made secret for 30 years. It didn't become public until recently from a Freedom of Information Act request. Is when it finally became public. And it basically shows that Scotland was very, very rich and plentiful, was doing very well for itself, but Westminster didn't want anybody to know that. And you'll see here some of the reasoning of it and that sort of thing. So we're going to go ahead and go into the article. Like I said, be looking for my next video that I'm going to be making regarding the Macron report, because that's going to be, like I said, it's very, very interesting that Westminster decided to bury it. Okay? Yeah. So we're going to be looking into that next. So here we go. This article is going to be talking about debt loading. It's going to be talking about how Scotland had an abundance of surpluses in the 1980s and 90s, and what Scotland could have done with those surpluses had it been in an independent nation. And so that's what this article is going to be going through. So it's interesting. Here we go, and we'll see you at the end. Okay, and here's the article. Written by Gordon McIntyre Kemp, revealed the accounting trick that hides Scotland's wealth 2020. So there's Mr. Gordon McIntyre Kemp there. So, every Westminster government in your lifetime has knowingly diverted tens of billions of pounds of Scottish revenues to Westminster. This has led to lower investment in Scotland, higher unemployment, lower economic growth, lower standards of living, economic migration, and growing inequality and poverty, all of which would not have been the case if Scotland was an independent country. Internationally, this is the sort of government behavior that often leads to demonstrations and makes headline news. This might have happened here if it wasn't for the fact that the Scottish people have largely remained unaware of the nation's wealth draining south. In this article, we will expose the accounting trick that hides Scotland's wealth. We will also apply undeniable evidence to demonstrate that if Scotland was already an independent country, our economy would be booming and public finances would be debt-free. The confidence trick. For generations, the people of Scotland have been fed a negative narrative on Scotland's economy. A depressing picture of Scotland has been drawn by Westminster politicians, portraying it as a subsidized state dependent on the UK for charitable handouts, with higher levels of debt and a dependency on the public sector. Scotland has been told that without the generosity of the UK to bail it out, it would be a bankrupt nation, unable to meet the very basic needs and wants of its people. This narrative is fundamentally untrue. There is simply no evidence to support it whatsoever. So manifestly untrue, in fact, that all available economic data entirely contradicts the age-old, absurd, and tired Westminster proposition that Scotland could not succeed as an independent, self-governing country. The too small, too poor, and too stupid argument has become so completely discredited that none of the major players in the 2014 No campaign dared to suggest it. Politicians have retreated from suggesting that Scotland's economy is a basket case, as the truth is now easily sourced. The UK government hid evidence, such as the Macron report, which I will be covering in the video right after this one, folks, classified as top secret for 30 years by the 1970s Labour government, but is now publicly available. The report states that the SNP had underestimated the nation's oil wealth, and that an independent Scotland would suffer from an embarrassment of riches. That report was written in 1974 and classified as secret due to the worries about restless natives if its facts were known by the masses in Scotland. It was eventually made public only after a Freedom of Information Act request in 2005. A few years ago, the former Chancellor, Dennis Healey, in an exclusive interview with Hollywood Magazine said, Scotland pays its fair share, and that these myths are simply perpetuated by those who oppose independence, and that Scotland's oil wealth had been squandered by Westminster rather than invested, while being underplayed in value terms by the UK government to subdue calls for Scottish independence. So UK is taking all that oil revenue, but they're underplaying the value of that oil in what they say to Scotland. So that's what that's basically getting at right there. That MP is saying that Scotland's getting shortchanged essentially. It's not all about oil though, as is made remarkably clear from the evidence in our publication Scotland the Brief. Scotland has everything that it takes to be an extremely prosperous and successful independent nation and more. Scotland, with only 8.4% of the UK population, possesses 34% of the UK's natural wealth. That's something I've been pointing out as well, folks. That is true. That is 100% true. This prompts the question, why does a naturally wealthy nation with a strong, resilient, and diverse onshore economy, booming exports, a highly educated population, low unemployment, a wealth of oil and renewables, and a wide range of strong economic sectors have a set of accounts, such as the GERS, that suggest that Scotland's finances are weak? That is a trick question. It doesn't. GERS is not a set of accounts for spending in Scotland. It contains spending outside of Scotland that doesn't benefit Scotland economy and that Scotland didn't generate. GERS also contain clear evidence of mechanisms for removing wealth from Scotland's accounts, which then creates a phony deficit. There are actually several hidden mechanisms for stealthily removing Scotland's wealth. One we will look at in this article is debt loading. How debt loading works. There is an expenditure line in the GERS. The GERS is a financial report generated by the UK every year regarding Scotland's output, essentially, financially. It's the sixth. Let's see here. It's the sixth largest expenditure of the Scottish government, and a larger spend than Scotland's allocated share of the UK Armed Forces expenditure. Historical analysis of GERS reports demonstrates that every year since records began, Scotland has been paying interest on a population share of the UK's debts. In the last 5 years, PSDI has added 16.2 billion, an average of 3.24 billion per year, to the cost of running Scotland. That's not paying back the capital on any debt. It's just an interest on the UK's debt. Scotland has recently been granted very limited borrowing powers, but while the UK's debt was being built up, Scotland had no borrowing powers. In fact, Scotland's economy was either in surplus or had a lower deficit than the UK, so Scotland did not contribute to the creation of the debt. How does a nation without the ability to borrow end up paying billions of interest on debt every year? It does so because the allocation of the debt is not related to the UK region or nation which generated the debt, nor where the money was spent or the economic benefit felt. The UK's debt is allocated to Scotland's accounts on a population percentage basis, even though Scotland did not generate that debt. Looking at Scotland's GERS report that go back 39 years, Scotland's share of UK debt interest amounted to a staggering 126 billion. However, analyzing those figures also demonstrates that had Scotland been an independent country, its entire borrowing requirement over those 39 years would have been zero. Let me be clear, nothing, not 1 penny. Scotland's accounts have had a 126 billion pound of interest on debt removed from them, despite the fact that Scotland did not generate nor benefit from this spending. This has happened simply because it is not an independent nation and had to chip in to service the rest of the UK's rising debts. Without that $126 billion cost, Scotland's finances would be in surplus today. If we look back as far as reliable historical figures for Scotland's revenues and expenditure go, we can see that in 1980 and 81, before the UK debt started to spiral, Scotland was charged $2.9 billion to service the UK debt. Despite that, it managed to record a surplus of more than $1 billion. Indeed, using GERS, Scotland's finances showed a surplus until 1990, when the cumulative surplus amounted to £38 billion. 72.6 billion surplus without debt loading. It is undeniable that in an independent Scotland, those surpluses would either have been invested to grow Scotland's economy or possibly put into a sovereign wealth fund similar to Norway's. And they suggest that because Norway is actually of a similar size and has a lot of similarities with Scotland, so they're using Norway, something Norway did as an example. Let's explore 3 alternative scenarios for how an independent Scotland could have managed its finances. Okay, so this is what the UK government claims happened. This is the graph here. So what you're seeing here is where they started. This is in 1980, right? But we just read that in 80 and 81, Scotland had a surplus. So what you see is this line here is that surplus. Surplus. That was a gathering for a few years, right? But then it eventually has somehow dwindled all the way down to here. Now, keep in mind, Scotland had no borrowing powers, whatever, nothing. Not until very recently has Scotland, Parliament had any kind of borrowing powers, right? Way over here, 2016 or something is when they got that, right? Or maybe it might have been in 2014. But the point is borrowing didn't become available till way over here. So this stuff here, this was all surplus. This all just went straight into the UK's coffers, it would seem. Scotland was part of the UK, and so past Scottish surpluses went to the UK Treasury, meaning that Scotland was actually subsidizing the UK. Over time, the burden of the UK debt payments on Scotland's economy started to weigh it down. This meant that the surpluses falsely looked like they declined during the 1990s, and the cumulative surpluses were eaten up by the UK debt-related deficits. As a result, the GERS report now show a cumulative but phony deficit of £170.5 billion. The UK debt is a mind-blowing wow, that is let me see, that would be £1,821,000,000,000, equivalent to 85.2% of the GDP of the UK. Wow. Let's be clear. UK debts have been growing steadily over those 38 years. Any budget allocated to Scotland's accounts in that time that is of a higher value than Scotland's revenues is not a subsidy. It is a loan that Scotland has to pay the interest on. A loan that Scotland only seemed to need because it was subsidizing the rest of the UK, and much of those loans was spent outside of Scotland and did not benefit Scotland. It is a fact that as an independent nation, Scotland would have possessed those cumulative surpluses of $72.6 billion and could have chosen to reinvest in Scotland's economy. This would have grown Scotland's economy significantly quicker than what has happened under Westminster management. An independent Scotland would not have accrued the $126 billion of debt interest charges, as it wouldn't have needed any debt of its own. That is why you can't use GERS as an argument against independence. Allocating interest charges on debt that Scotland did not generate allows GERS to show a deficit. GERS assumes that those surpluses disappeared into thin air, and that could not have happened. It is an undeniable fact that in an independent Scotland, those surpluses would either have been invested to grow Scotland's economy or possibly put into a sovereign wealth fund for future benefit of our nation, as Norway has done. So, what could Scotland have done with those surpluses? So here, this graph is, what is the daftest thing that the leadership in Scotland could have done with those surpluses? You know, what is the absolute daftest thing they could have done with it? Well, assuming that an independent Scotland would not have gifted its massive surpluses to another country so that the other country could pay down its debts, what is the lowest rate of return on independent Scotland could have received on those 1980 surpluses? What if an independent Scotland's government had been so daft, so absolutely incompetent, that it could not figure out how to invest those massive surpluses, and as a result did nothing with them but stuff them into a bank and let them gain interest at the standard market rate? Even in this case, that government would have had to have made significantly worse economic decisions and more mistakes than Westminster did in running Scotland's economy, to not see the significant growth and better finances than those Scotland experiences as part of the UK. What if we all assume the worst, and that even without those debt interest payments holding Scotland's economy back, Scottish government revenues didn't rise, and that the economy grew much more slowly than other European nations with comparable populations? What would have happened? No, we are making this as a negative of a projection as possible. Well, those cumulative surpluses plus standard bank rates of interest would have topped out at 410 billion cash reserves in the bank in 2008 and 9, and then started to fall until we had 337.7 billion in the bank today. So that's what all those surpluses had. If Scotland was independent and had been able to use that money that its economy, that surplus that its economy had created, if it had been able to reinvest that into Scotland, things might be, a lot of things might be a lot better about quality of life there in Scotland, is basically what this is getting at. I can't say I disagree. That's sound reasoning. So, what would Norway have done? Let's assume Scotland's government just banked the early surpluses until it noticed Norway was starting an oil fund and decided to copy it. Applying the same annual rates of return that Norway received on its investments since 1998-99, Scotland's National Oil Wealth Fund would now be worth £773 billion. Remember that Norway is a small to medium-sized independent northern European nation with roughly the same population size as Scotland has, produced 1% less oil and gas than Scotland. Norway's sovereign wealth fund today is worth 826 billion. That's a lot more than I am suggesting Scotland's would be worth, because I have used the low revenues that the UK mismanagement of Scottish oil and gas resources generated, not the much higher Norwegian ones. Over 38 years, the cost to Scotland of being part of the UK in monetary terms, if our government was almost as competent as Norway's, is almost 1 trillion is almost 1 trillion. That's the difference between what Norway would have done and what the UK government did with our surpluses. That's 14.4 billion a year, a 1.2 billion a month. And people wonder why we have the second worst pension in the developed world, yet the UK government thinks it can afford to pay more. It's basically going to put all these different options that could have been, exercised, basically, or that could have happened if Scotland was independent back in 1980. It's fairly simple and becomes extremely obvious when you have access to the data The UK government has diverted Scotland's wealth to the UK Treasury to pay off its debts. Thus, it creates 100% of Scotland's supposed debts and 100% of its phony deficit. The UK government then announced that they will spend $5 million on an advertising campaign to tell the people of Scotland that they can't afford to be independent. I would suggest that it's likely that $5 million advertising budget will be classed out of Scotland, out of a Scottish expenditure. I can't say I think he's wrong there. I think he's probably 100% right about that. The daftest thing Scotland could have done as an independent nation would have left Scotland at least £508 billion better off today than Gers falsely suggests it is as part of the UK. However, had the government of an independent Scotland simply copied Norway, then Scotland would now be $943 billion better off than Gers would suggest. This is the impact of Westminster's debt loading alone, and upon that accounting trick rests the entire economic case for the Union. We welcome the appointment of Kate Forbes, MSP, as the new Scottish Finance Minister, and we hope that she and the SNP will change tack. There must be a better explanation to the people of Scotland about the Gers and what it actually says, and that Scotland actually does not have a deficit. The research findings referred to in this article are contained in our book. You can purchase your copy of Scotland the Brief. Yeah, so if you guys want to learn more about this, obviously you can get their book, Scotland the Brief. I may go ahead and pick that up just because I'm interested. But that is this here article is very interesting. So I mean, this is what actually happened with Scottish finances, okay, under UK management. Okay, so that's what that line is, right? This green line is if the Scottish government had just taken its surpluses from the 1980s and everything and just put them into a regular bank account, standard interest that you get on a bank account, and you can see what would have happened there, right? And they're up and around what is it? 400, almost, yeah, basically around 400 billion, right? Then if you look at this blue line here, which follows the green line pretty much almost exactly, except around 1999 is when Norway started its what's it called? What was it called? The Sovereign Wealth Fund. There you go, the Sovereign Wealth Fund. So then Scotland could have followed suit with Norway at that point, and this is what Scotland's earnings would have been with all of that money that was a surplus in the 80s. And so today, Scotland would be sitting with about up to $1 trillion more than it currently has, and if it were independent. But because it's under Westminster management, this is what Westminster is trying to tell Scotland, and this is why they continue to say how poor and beggarly Scotland is, and it can't afford to be on its own. It's basically, well, it's like that John Mayer song says, when they control the information, they can bend it all they want. All right, so there you have it. Very interesting, talking about how Scotland most likely has this perceived debt, or he calls it the phony deficit, but it's at this point perceived that way because obviously the information is controlled in a sense by Westminster of what Gers is their report basically. So anyway, it as he says in the article, it doesn't report everything. It only reports Scotland spending that doesn't have to do with Scotland, basically. So anyways, so I'm gonna go ahead and grab a copy of this book, the Scotland the Brief. I'm gonna grab that because I'm imagining it's probably gonna have a hell of a lot of very interesting information in it, and a lot of answers to some questions that I have had, and questions that don't seem to be just right out there and easy to find the answer to. I'm suspecting I'm going to find several in that book. So I'm going to check that book out. yeah, so it's very interesting. Scotland is not a poor and beggarly nation as like the British media and stuff would have you believe. It's not. They're I mean, they have a tremendous, I mean, they bring 1/3 of the resources, natural resources and revenue created from natural resources to the table in the UK. 1/3 coming from Scotland, which is 8.4% of the population of the UK. But yet they're bringing 1/3 of that. You know, I mean, Scotland's in a good position to be on its own. And judging by all of the disingenuous crap I see coming out of Westminster, I think Scotland's better off on their own. Considering so much of Scotland is pretty in agreement on the fact that they want to be in the EU, since that's something that they agree on, it's another reason why becoming independent is advantageous for Scotland. Besides the fact that they've been getting a crap deal from Westminster. So, all right, look forward to my video coming up about the Macron report. Going to be very interesting, obviously. So if you haven't already, please hit subscribe, and we'll see you.